Inspiration comes in all shapes and forms, yet little did I realize a worn-out beach towel left behind by a friend of my son would provide the catalyst for Sewing with Nancy miniseries. The towel, as you can see, is well worn, has an interesting design, columns of color with square inserts. This inspiration led to a quilt with the same column concept, ideal for a baby or toddler. The linear design is not only attractive, it's also easy to sew. Column quilts. That's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, is made possible by Baby Lock, a complete line of sewing, quilting, and embroidery machines and sergers. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Madeira, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effect threads, because creativity is never black and white. Koala Studios, fine sewing furniture custom built in America. Clover, makers of sewing, knitting, quilting, and embroidery products for over 25 years. Experience the Clover difference. And amazing designs and Class A needles.
Never did I think that a beach towel would be an inspiration for a quilt, but when I saw this rather ratty towel left behind at our house, and I was folding it after doing the laundry, I couldn't help but think, a quilt pattern, what a great quilt pattern. Quickly went into my sewing room, did some measuring and cutting, and within about 30 minutes was able to figure out how to create the columns. It's a great style, as you can see, for toddlers and babies because of the brightness. And we were able to follow the same lead that the towel gave us to work with the columns in the quilt. All straight and simple sewing. We call it follow my lead because the colors go from one to the other. For example, the peach color is the lead color, then becomes the center. The red is the main color, becomes the center. It just follows along in a continuous color flow. The rainbow colors work well for this. And on the back of the towel, because of the way this is woven, the opposite colors come through. What was light is now dark, and dark is now light. So taking that lead, since it's the follow my lead quilt, we did the same with the quilt. And I'll fold back the border, and you can see that what was one in the middle is now on the column, and what was in the column is now in the middle, and it makes an interesting design. Now you certainly could make just the front part of it in this design and have a solid back, or you could do just as we did. I'm just going to show you the technique, the stitching technique. If you're a non-quilter, this may be your first quilting project because it's all straight seams and really doesn't follow all of the basic quilting concepts. It's so easy to sew. We have the 6 color combinations, and then later in the show I'm going to show you a full-size quilt or a queen-size quilt made with this concept in more subtle colorations, but choose 6 colors and then do some cutting. Now each of the fabrics for the one side will be cut with the same number of strips. And we'll look at the purple strip so you can see the cuts that we have. This is all crosswise cut. There's one strip that's 5 inches, and then 3 strips that are 2.5 inches. 1 at 5 and 3 at 2.5. And that's going to be the same measurement that you're going to do all across the board for all 6 sizes. To get the follow my lead concept, we're going to have a little sleight of hand, a little shuffling of the fabric strips, and we'll start way down at the blue end. And one of the 2.5 inch wide strips I'd like you to cut in half, right down the center of the fold. And using just one of those strips, one of these short strips, they're now approximately 22 inches long, meet it to the green piece. Cut the green into half and place it on the yellow. And I think you get the sequence now. The yellow is cut in half, and one of those strips is placed on the peach. And we'll just keep moving along down the line. I've already pre-cut these, and keep the same color, one of the same color, still in the stack. And after we get to the purple, we'll take this purple and go to the blue. So everybody has a contrasting center. So now that you've done the shuffle, then you can now do the stitching of creating the column quilts. You rarely think of quilts in columns. They're squares, triangles, blocks. You may use those terms, but not too often columns. To get the length that's needed for the columns for this baby-sized quilt, toddler quilt, we're going to use the full length of the strips. And here you can see the column, how it's starting to create. And so we'll just have the full length, but it's not quite long enough, at least for the length that we have here. And the remaining strip that was cut in half for the follow my lead now is going to be folded, and find my scissors and cut in half again. So these small, around 10 to 11 inch strips will be sewn to the ends of the long strip just to make length, just to make columns. We're not making blocks or squares, we're making columns. So here we have columns that are long. They've been pieced together, just short little pieces, and you can, here's my seam, I have the seam pieced. So instead of this being around 42 inches in length, now it's about 52 inches in length. So the sides of each column have now been created. That's fast. So a little extra length is needed. Now the remaining pieces that you have are the strip of the contrasting color and then a 5.5 inch strip. We'll just cut this in half. You're going to have a little extra fabric left over that if you're creating the reversible quilt as we have here, you'll be able to use this, but I'm just going to show you one side. And this piece, the large 5 inch piece is sewn to the contrasting color. And here I have one sewn. And just do some pressing. I'll just do that pressing for you right now. When pressing quilt strips, often I like to press the seam flat and then press it to a side. By pressing it flat, you kind of embed the stitches in the seam, and it makes it easier to press it open. And if you press it from the right side, you're not going to get a little tuck that so often occurs if you sometimes go on this side. You may press in a tuck, so press from the right side. Now after this strip has been sewn together, you're going to subcut it. You know the popular bumper sticker that says quilters never die, they just go to pieces? Well, that certainly applies. We just cut and recut some pieces. I always like to cut with the majority of the fabric to my right, and I have a little selvage here that I'm going to trim off. And then cut these into 2.5 inch strips. And you'll cut what you need. And just keep cutting this length of fabric until you have cut the 2.5 inch strips. Now the next step is to sew these together. But obviously we're not going to sew them together in the way that we cut them, but we're going to sew end to end. The columns are created by doing a little magic and sewing them end to end. And I usually sew these together in a chain piecing technique. Here's a close-up of sewing the strips end to end to sew pairs together, as many as you need for the column or perhaps the whole quilt. The last step that you need to create the column is really quite simple. You had one of these 5 inch strips left over. We'll cut a 2.5 inch strip from this. And I have already done this because you need to sew it to the end of your chain. And I'm going to sew it with a pin right now. Kind of just place it in there. That would assume that's sewn and it's pinned very kind of uneven, but I think you get the concept. And this is all, then the length will equal the length of your columns. So meet right sides together and sew the column strips. Right sides together, sew with a 1/4 inch seam, right sides together, keep on doing it. And then press the seams toward the column strips, away from the center, as I have done on this sample, and you've created a column. How simple is that? You do the same process for each of the 6 stacks. We've done one already, and I'll show you the layout, as you can see behind me already, but we had the purple followed by the beautiful color with the red and the peach, and it just keeps on going. And I have smaller strip lengths right here on my sample, just because it's just a little bit easier to fit on my board. But then you can see how the color works. Now, if we're going to sew these in columns as well. We're not going to sew all of the fabrics together and then add a backing. We're going to follow the column quilt technique and just keep adding columns. The reverse side will be made in the opposite color combination. What was predominant is now the smaller section. So on the reverse side, you can make the same idea, only reverse the color options. Let's see, I think I have these almost ready to go. And just make a second set if you'd like to make the quilt look, have a pattern both on the front and the back. We're going to show you, next I'm going to show you how to take this concept and work it so that you're able to sew it reversible and in the column size. That's an easy step. During this two-part series on column quilts, I'll give you techniques on piecing in columns as well as quilting in columns. And now is the chance to do the quilting technique. Rather than sewing the columns together at this point, we're going to add flannel backing. Now, flannel can be a great option for batting. Pre-wash your flannel because it will shrink more than the outer fabrics. And I usually do like to pre-wash those of making them for blankets or quilts. And here we have a strip that's approximately 6.5 inches wide. Measure the width of your strip and cut the batting, or in this instance the flannel, the width of the strip. And set up your machine for basic quilting techniques. We have a patchwork foot attached that has the width of the side of the foot is 1/4 of an inch, standard quilting seam, all-purpose sewing thread, a quilting needle, and the machine is set for the length about 10 to 12 stitches per inch. So nothing too difficult about that. And then we'll just do some stitching in the ditch, that funny sewing term of stitching in the groove of the seam, sewing layers together. So I'm just sewing down the middle. Now I have contrasting thread in my machine, and of course you would just use matching threads so that if you stitched out of the ditch, you wouldn't see the stitching. So mindless sewing. Sometimes I like sewing like this because you can think about other things and while getting sewing done. So you'd sew in the ditch, stitch in the ditch of the seam, and you'd do the same on the other side. Doesn't take too much to figure that out. You may, after this point, to give your quilt column, not block, but a press, because it may need a little steaming after this top. So just give it a press. And do all, or stitch all of the columns in this way, even the backing fabric, matching the flannel to the underside. After you've sewn, in this instance, 12 columns with flannel. Now, just as a caveat, in the second program of this series, I'll show you how to use batting if you'd like to do that. You can also use that technique. But in this one, we're just using flannel. Pair together the columns that will be back to back. Let's just take a look at the finished quilt just quickly so that you can kind of get that concept. On this side, I have the purple with the red in the center. And on the flip side, what matches it is the red with the purple in the center. So I'm going to stack those two together. And here you can see the peach with the red, and then that would be stacked with the red with the peach. You can get that. So I've started to stack these so I know which sections go together. You would have 6 stacks at this point. The first stack, the purple and red in my example, those 2 stacks are going to be met wrong sides together, just the way they will be when they're finished. And I've edge stitched, just with a very narrow seam, it's sewn into a tube. To make certain that the blocks were backed, I put a pin through one corner and made sure it came out of the other corner so that the length would be appropriate. Now, to quilt in columns comes next. The remaining stacks of fabric, here I have the red, which would be the next follow my leaf column for this side. I would meet it right sides together to the purple side. And again, you may want to fold it back so that to make certain that the blocks are lining up. You may find that you may have to just change that length just a touch. And I'm going to lay this flat so I can pin it a little bit better. And the opposite side would be right sides together to meet the underside. So I have a thick sandwich of a peach to a red on this side, and I'd like to line up those quilt blocks, and then a red to a purple, whatever color combination you have. Now in this instance, I would slightly lengthen the stitch. You have lots of layers to go through, and as I pin this, I'm just going to make sure I line it up. And 1/4 of an inch seam allowance is all that's next. So line it up. You're going to have a longer stitch, and a longer seam, I should say, and I'm going to lengthen that stitch and sew away. Take a little time to do this sewing. Make sure you try to stitch as straight as you can. I mentioned earlier that this is maybe a non-quilter's quilt, maybe your first quilt project, because the sewing is all straight. And the color combinations can be fun. And I have my edges just a little bit askew. Let's line them up a better. After you sew each strip, then the next step will be to do the pressing. And I'll press this open, and you'd add all subsequent columns in the same manner. I'll be opening this up, and it's starting to look like the column quilt. Now, as a little press, before I would do the next step, I'd press all the seam allowances toward the sewn seam. And after you press the whole length, stitch the edges together and add your next column. You'll find instructions in the book that accompanies today's program to add the binding in the same manner. Same technique, make it wide or narrow, and you'll have a column quilt. Once you've mastered the follow my lead concept, take your new skill to a larger palette. By increasing the length and number of columns, this easy-to-piece design may be easily transformed to a queen-size bed quilt. The gradation of colors, light to dark and back again, provides great visual impact. We had a great time putting this quilt top together. Same pattern design of the columns, but just more of them, and as I mentioned, longer in length. If you take a look at what I have on the table, we're going to start at the light side, and these beautiful prints, very subtle, gradate from light to a little bit darker to the mauve color, cocoa, some browns, and then the darkest panel is the darkest one that you see. And that's 6 columns, and we made this 11 columns wide because then the center one is not repeated, but the mirror image of this gradation begins going back in the other direction. So 11 columns, and instead of the lengths being 52 inches, the lengths are much longer, you'll see in a few minutes. So you can create this mirror image look if you'd like. You could use many color combinations. You're the designer, but this just gives you one more option. We have some of the cutouts here to show you. We don't have all 6, but we have 5 colors to show you how, again, you would do the follow my lead. But instead of cutting the strips in half, you're going to use full strips. And then you're going to be needing double or maybe a little bit more, depending upon the length that you'd like to make for your quilt. But just move one strip to each pile and do the little transformation. And you're going to, again, be stitching the 5-inch wide strip. Remember, you're going to have one 5-inch wide strip and about 6 to 7 2.5-inch lengths, and you're going to be sewing these into long lengths just as before. Same concept, but I just want to give you a hint on working with the length. To achieve length, you're going to stitch together 2 1/4 strips. Usually you don't talk about stitching strips together, but take one of the 2.5-inch wide strip, fold it in half. Let's just trim off the selvage. That would be a little bit better. Trim off the selvage, fold it in half, fold it in half again, and then cut the folds. And that will give you, give or take, quarters. This is not an exact science. So then sew end to end, 2 strips plus 1/4. And here's our long length. The length that we have in this finished quilt, which includes borders, is 113 inches, great for a king or queen size bed. So here we have this very long length. Just sew as many strips together as you'd like to create for your column quilt. And then when sewing this together, again, you're going to be sewing the end to end of the pieces of the 5-inch strip, sewing these end to end, and we have a contrasting fabric and color combination, but you can see that these would be chain stitched together just as I did earlier. Then add the columns on both sides and some straight stitching techniques, and you've created a supersized Follow My Lead quilt. Sewing and quilting are great hobbies, as we know. For many of us, these skills have helped us cope during times of healing and grieving. My Nancy's Corner guest, Cherie Milton, shows how quilting can play a part in the healing process, particularly the grieving process. She's here to tell us about memorial quilts. Cherie, welcome to Sewing with Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks for having me.
As a grief counselor through hospice, you have a unique way of incorporating quilting, as I mentioned, in the healing process.
We do. All of our families that are served and have loved ones that die with hospice care are sent quilt squares a few months after the death with minimal instructions to put the square together however they would like to memorialize their loved one. And they send them back, and our volunteer quilters put it together.
And you make about 2 of these a year.
Correct. Actually, we have 2 ceremonies, and each include 4 quilts, so 8 total for a year.
So the memorial quilt ceremony is part of the process of healing.
Absolutely. Families find it comforting to think about what special way they can represent their loved one on that square.
And we're going to showcase a few of those squares because they're very touching.
They are.
Tell us about the dance square.
There is a particular square on this quilt that I brought today that just represents all of the favorite things of this dear lady that passed away with hospice care.
And they just put them down, no special order, it's just fun.
Exactly.
I'm sure this lady's spirit lives on in all their family members.
Exactly. If you look, you can see there's a dance patch, there's a little thing that represents Christmas, there's something that represents her love for bowling.
It's delightful. And then photo transfer technique is really popular in this memory quilt.
It is. It is. Several of our squares on this particular quilt have photo transfers of their loved one along with other various mediums.
We get comments from Sewing with Nancy viewers how they have healed through an illness, through grieving, and even just making these small quilt squares is a positive thing.
Very positive. They take great care in deciding, and then when they bring them back to us to have it assembled, even the way they bring them to our facility with great tenderness.
It's touching.
It
now,
is.
not all quilt squares have to have names and dates. This one is very simplistic.
It is. It's very simplistic, no name included, but you can tell that the scene represents something very important to their loved ones.
I love the variety in this. And then we have another one that shows some interest in painting as well as fabric.
Absolutely. The family member that designed that quilt took a picture of their loved one and then actually hand painted alongside a scene that somehow represents the family and that dear loved one of theirs.
So your memorial quilt dedication ceremony, tell me a little bit more about that, Cherie.
Currently we have 2 a year, and we have about 500 folks each ceremony, family members of those deceased. They come, they see the quilts assembled. We read everyone's name that is represented.
Great.
Very beautiful.
A great thing. And then you don't put these away. You hang them up.
We do. All of our quilts are brought back to our hospice care facility, and they're hung in prominent places. And throughout the year, many family members come back to visit, see this quilt, see the square, and then they're rotated throughout our facility.
What a great way of working with fabric in the grieving process.
It is.
Now, our viewers can go to the sewingwithnancy.com website and then click on under Nancy's Corner in the 2400 series, and you'll find link to the hospice care where Cherie works and some information about the memorial quilt and the dedication.
Yes.
And it's a great way of thinking about sewing and quilting in a different manner.
It is.
Thank you for being our guest.
Thank you.
Most enjoyable, and thank you for watching Sewing with Nancy and for being part of this program. We have a second program during this two-part series on column quilts. I'll be back next time with that. Bye for now.
Nancy has written a fully illustrated book entitled Column Quilts that includes all the information from this two-part series. It's $14.99 plus shipping and handling. To order the book, call 800-336-8373 or visit our website at sewingwithnancy.com/2415. Order item number BK2415, Column Quilts. Credit card orders only. To pay by check or money order, call the number on the screen for details. Visit Nancy's website at sewingwithnancy.com for more information on this program. Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, has been brought to you by Baby Lock, Madeira Threads, Koala Studios, Clover, Amazing Designs, and Classe Needles. Closed captioning funding provided by Rowenta. Sewing with Nancy is a co-production of Nancy Zieman Productions and Wisconsin Public Television.